I don't think anyone in this room genuinely believes that the mandatory digital ID is about illegal working, which begs the question, what is it really about? The Prime Minister has killed support for digital ID. We can see that in the polls. We also see it in the fact that the petition, the e-petition on this issue, is the fourth biggest petition in British history. We've never had nationals need to have a permit in this country to go about our everyday lives, and so the mandatory nature of what has been proposed would introduce that. Thank you very much. Silkie Carlo, I'm the director of Big Brother Watch. We're a privacy and civil liberties non-profit, non-party campaign group in the UK. I have engaged with the government over the past 10 years on digital identity matters in various forms, including being on the Privacy and Consumer Advisory Group and engaging with the recent data bills on digital identity verification.
What risk do you think, like, the mandatory element of digital ID presents to somebody's privacy and other rights?
I think that the mandatory nature of the proposed digital ID scheme is really the heart of the problem. Digital identities are something that we all use every day in various different ways, but a government-issued mandatory digital ID has the potential to create a incredibly intrusive system of surveillance, data collection. It opens up possibilities for the government to issue and revoke permissions in certain ways. And I think where I disagree slightly about the e-visa, the e-visa scheme is something we should certainly talk about, because it has been blighted with very serious issues, which has obstructed people from accessing essential services. But a visa is essentially a permit. We've never had nationals need to have a permit in this country to go about our everyday lives, and so the mandatory nature of what has been proposed would introduce that suddenly we would be a country that is on licence, that needs a government permit to do something that otherwise we would have the freedom to do. And I think in terms of giving people, and in fact why your inboxes are so full perhaps, is that mandatory nature of the ID coupled with a restriction on liberty, which is what the government has suggested, for something you would otherwise lawfully be able to do. Now, unless you have this digital ID card, you won't be able to work. And already other government departments are talking about renting, benefits, education, etc. So I think that we would be having a completely different conversation if the government were talking about a system it thought was so attractive that if it made it available, lots of people would want to use it. Instead, it's a mandatory system that is paired with restrictions on people's liberties.
And we have got questions on e-visas later, so if we can just focus on the specifics around the mandatory nature.
Do you have any examples of individual rights in other countries that you feel have been affected by this?
Yeah, talking of the Aadhaar scheme in India, something that's often overlooked is that scheme has even been linked to citizen deaths. Through, for example, accessibility problems. That's a massive biometric identity system of over 1 billion people. And that has access issues, because it's required for access to welfare, access issues have been documented to have resulted in people actually dying. So incredibly serious consequences. Also, that system holds health data and has individuals have been refused healthcare because of their HIV/AIDS status, for instance, which is held on this digital identifier. But I do think we see examples of abuses closer to home as well. We've spoken about the cybersecurity risks. So when individuals are enrolled in mandatory systems, you lose that control over how you manage your data. You're relying on either the companies or the state. And Estonia, often held up as being the gold standard example, has suffered multiple cybersecurity incidents where people's photos have been leaked, etc. And on a more individual basis, for example, a police officer in Estonia was fined for checking his fiance's criminal record. So you get access problems as well, where people get unauthorised access to giant databases.
Finally, how do you see it going forward, a kind of a creep in digital ID, that people's privacy and human rights are at risk? Is that something that worries you?
We are incredibly worried about function creep with this system, and right from the off, really, I think the warning signs have been there. This was introduced by the government as something ostensibly to tackle illegal working. I don't think anyone in this room genuinely believes that the mandatory digital ID is about illegal working, which begs the question, what is it really about, and what will the other uses be? Already, you know, in the Friday afternoon that this was announced by the Prime Minister, just hours later, the government webpage about digital ID was talking about tax benefits, education, childcare, many other uses for a digital ID. So function creep is inherent in the system, and I think people rightly be concerned about that. Even in the I would have to correct myself, actually. I said that we never have had a mandatory ID. There was the wartime ID cards, of course, but they, even they, which were initially issued for rationing, ended up sprawling to 39 government agencies before they were scrapped by the Churchill government. So it's inherent to any system. And the other side of what is so concerning about that, these other use cases, is again, if this is starting with the pairing of a restriction on liberty, what will the other restrictions be? In many people's minds in this country, the most recent experience of a digital pass was the COVID pass, and in that case, there were restrictions placed on people depending on where you could go and what you could do based on your vaccination status, for example. So there we saw a digital identity system that had very sensitive data that then controlled where you could go and what you could do, and was also seen by many to be an attempt to influence decisions. Again, in that case, certain people couldn't work in health and social care, for example, if you didn't have the right vaccination status. So I think function creep is both inevitable and an overriding concern with this system.
Giamora.
Thank you very much. The concerns that you've raised are ones which I know are sort of echoed by my constituents, and I do wonder what kind of safeguards might help reassure you and my citizens about a digital ID scheme, which does have its advantages to it. And so, for example, I mean, can you think of examples which would help? And so, for example, we've talked about perhaps the option to delete all your data that's held by government at one time, or and I think this is the Estonian model, that each time your data is accessed, you have some kind of, you're told when your data is accessed, which isn't the case now. I mean, I don't know who in government's looking at my data. But do you think those would help reassure you and help reassure the public about a digital ID?
I think that it's likely that the way that this announcement has been managed makes it irrecoverable for this government and potentially for the next 5 to 10 years. I'm afraid to say, I think the Prime Minister has killed support for digital ID. We can see that in the polls. We also see it in the fact that the petition, the e-petition on this issue, is the 4th biggest petition in British history, second biggest petition on a non-Brexit issue. Your constituents are up in arms about it, and I think it is because of that, the way that it's been introduced, the fact that no one really believes it's about immigration, and it might be about something else. And how poorly explained the system has been. In that sense, it also makes it very difficult to recommend safeguards, because there isn't actually a policy here. There's been an announcement, and I've engaged with the government on digital ID issues, as I say, for a decade. I've spent many times in government offices with civil servants talking about how a system could be created. We have seen none of that reflected at all in what has happened over recent weeks with this announcement. There has been no detail. There is no substance. If we're talking about, in theory, what kinds of safeguards could any kind of theoretical digital ID system have, we could have a very long conversation about it. Certainly the starting point would be that it shouldn't be mandatory, that it should be optional. And that people can then take up a government-issued digital ID if they feel that it benefits them, that it should be something that they can exercise total control over, that they get to choose who sees their information, where, when, and for what purposes, and critically, as Ruth was saying as well, that we don't see a merging of government databases, which is a really big risk with digital ID systems, you know, the taxman can see your GP records, etc. Well, I have to say that is also an impetus with these systems, because the argument will be, well, why can't DWP see your health status? Why can't we integrate that? So in many different circumstances, there will be a strong impetus for that data to be shared, but that was something that would have to be very strongly legislated around to ensure that it couldn't happen.
Thank you. So I'm interested. So I have a background in the health service as a surgeon. So I'm interested in how the digital ID might link to the health record. You were talking about this just now, and it seems to me that if we could allow people ownership of their own health record, which was held digitally, that would give people agency over their own health care, and it would be an incentive for people to voluntarily take a digital ID, which would then be usable across different health agencies. Everybody has an NHS number, which is given to them when they're born. That might be a way into a system such as this. And it seems to me that encouraging people to engage in a digital ID system could be done by means of giving people agency over their own healthcare records, such that you were able to go between healthcare providers, hospitals and general practitioners with your own health record. And if you knew what was in your health record, a little bit more about your health, you would probably look after it a bit better. And so I would like to see the question of how the health record is incorporated into a digital ID spoken about a little bit more. Do you think that there's any mileage in thinking about it like that?
The legal position is that people have the right to access their health data. It could be presented in a much easier way, for sure. But I would be very sceptical about that being used in a kind of carrot and stick situation where, you know, if you have easier access to your health data, then you enrol in a digital ID, which is actually something different to just accessing your health data. You should just be able to access and control your health data irregardless of a digital ID.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to focus specifically on linking the digital ID to the right to work. I think you've been really clear on your kind of fundamental concerns and I suppose areas of principle which you disagree with. Is there any really specific concerns that you have around linking it to the right to work?
What has been proposed is a multi-billion pound system. And I think it would be right to start with why rather than why not. And I don't think it washes that a British passport is not British enough or good enough documentation to have the right to work, as people currently use, that instead you would need this new mandatory digital ID. We've seen with e-visas that has already locked people out of work because of the accessibility and technical problems that there have been with that scheme. So learning from that, aside from the principled issues and the rights issues and the lack of a basis for why this is necessary for right to work, we'd be very concerned about the practical implications of that. You know, and bearing in mind that it's everyone from. The government's been talking about teenagers as well, so it could be somebody doing their first paper round up to a pensioner working in their garden centre. It's a massive, massive scope for who would then be forced into this mandatory digital ID scheme.
Do you think there's any policy area in which digital ID would be justifiable in terms of supporting to help to enforce the law? I'm not really sure that there's. I mean, I've never heard an argument that we could enforce this area of the law so much better if only it were that we had mandatory digital IDs. It's just not something that I have come across, unless you go to a very extreme end of the surveillance spectrum, and that's one of the things that I'm really worried about here. In so much as what we do know about the digital ID system proposed is that it will be basically a massive facial recognition system because it would be linked to facial biometrics. That's one of the only substantive things we've been told about this government proposal. So that means that you would have around 50 million British adults with their sensitive personal biometric data in a system, and quite unusually as well, lots of foreign nationals as well, millions of foreign nationals. It's not actually a British only system because it relates to everyone who's working here. And given that this has been introduced at a time when the government is also backing a significant expansion of facial recognition surveillance in this country, and that we have also found, without discussing with Parliament, the government is now using the passport database for facial recognition searches, I'd be very worried about how, as you say, from a law enforcement perspective, this new gargantuan biometric system could also be used for that extension of surveillance.
Could you just outline how you think the government should account for digital exclusion when developing its plans for digital ID, whether that be mandatory or indeed not mandatory?
So the facial recognition aspect could introduce some exclusion factors because of the issues that there have been with misidentifications and facial recognition, particularly around race and gender, and also certain disabilities. But also inclusion in a system doesn't always need to mean that people are forced into a digital or a technological system, for example. I think there would have to be an offline alternative for the many, many people who don't have good connectivity, who don't have good digital skills, but also to acknowledge there are many people that don't want to be forced into a system like that don't want to have smartphones. I mean, the whole conversation around smartphones is changing as well, but the idea is that everyone would have a smartphone with a very, very essential piece of data on it. And I think that might not stand the test of time as well.
I just exposed the dangers of digital ID to Parliament. Now the fight against digital ID needs you. Head to no-to-digitalid.co.uk to take action.